Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Parallel Session 4 on the Transport Innovation and COVID-19 Recovery Impacts on Public Transport. My name is Robert Missen. I work in the Directorate General for Transport at the European Commission in Brussels. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound effect on transport, highlighting several key vulnerabilities of existing transport systems. COVID-19 also presents an opportunity to shape more sustainable, resilient and human-centric urban mobility. Many cities have put a focus on the reallocation of road space and promotion of alternative mobility options. Yet what are the likely impacts of COVID-19 on mobility patterns in the medium to long term? How will transport innovations such as mobility as a service and ITS support COVID-19 recovery and ensure that it is aligned with sustainability objectives? And what is the role of new mobility services in shaping the post-COVID mobility landscape? To look at these and other relevant questions, we have a panel of 4 experts to take you through this session today. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn to the first presenter, John Hultén. He's a director at K2, the Swedish Knowledge Centre for Public Transport. He manages and coordinated research activities in a unique collaboration between universities, research institutes, public transport agencies, and national authorities responsible for transport. He holds a PhD in political science from London University and has worked with strategic transportation policy and planning for more than 15 years within academia and in public agencies such as the Swedish Road Administration, Swedish Transport Administration, and as an advisor within the Government Office of Sweden. As a researcher, he has a particular interest in issues related to governance, funding, strategic planning, and organisational mobility. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I will try to share my slides here, first of all. There you go. Okay, Robert, please let me know if you can see my slides.
Yes, that's very well, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. So I will talk about opportunity for new roles, strategies and funding models in public transport post the pandemic. And this work and this presentation is based on an ongoing research project that we run in Sweden with the 3 Swedish metropolitan regions. But I do believe that some of the insights and thoughts that we are working with here are also relevant for other regions, contexts and countries. So before looking into more what will happen after the pandemic, I think it's wise and interesting to see also a little bit where we come from and have a look at the rear view mirror, so to speak. And if we look at how public transport developed in Sweden for the past decades, it has been a very positive development, actually. We have seen an increased ridership, and we have also seen an increased market share for public transport vis-a-vis private cars. And this is, of course, in line with political ambitions, and it's been sort of quite ambitious political and also agenda, and also a lot of emphasis on this from the public transport industry lately. However, increased public transport is also a challenge because, as you know, and as is the case in most countries, public transport is heavily subsidized by the public. So more public transport, more ridership also is a challenge on funding. And in Sweden, public transport is in general funded 50% through fare box revenues and 50% through taxes, mainly at the regional level. An additional challenge during the past decades has been that also the costs for operating public transport has increased. And as you can see from the yellow line here, the costs has increased more than the ridership. It has also increased more than the supply of public transport. So that is a challenge. Of course, these lines have dramatically changed over the past year or so. We suffered an enormous decrease in public transport ridership from March 2019. Although cost has remained on a very similar level as before. And if we look at this development a little bit more in detail in the three largest regions in Sweden, Stockholm is by far the largest metropolitan area in Sweden. We see that passenger journeys with public transport has decreased with something like 30 to 40% over the past year compared to the situation in 2019. We also see that ticket revenues have reduced even more than that, also depending on an increased fare evasion compared to the situation before. Total revenues for the regions, the public transport agencies, though, hasn't changed as much because the national government, the state level, has decided to subsidize public transport quite heavily during the pandemic. And cost, as you can see there, has remained more or less unchanged. So what will this mean for the future? Well, it's of course a lot of uncertainty there, but we can have a little bit of a look on previous research from other types of crisis situations that has been hitting public transport in the past. And we can see from previous pandemics, but also other types of disasters such as terror attacks, that people tend to feel a bit of fear of traveling with others after such an event, and that this fear factor tend to remain also after the crisis and when the crisis or the situation has gone away. So there is a sort of a factor here that has some significance and will have some significance probably also after the pandemic. However, in previous crisis situations, this is something that has not remained for very long. So after 3 to 6 months, it's generally difficult to see an effect of this from this fear of traveling with others. Another thing that we have seen a lot of during the pandemic, of course, is that people have changed their travel behaviors. And people have decided to travel by other modes at other times. They have traveled to different locations. They have also reduced the travel altogether, of course. And we have also seen in studies from previous disruptions to transportation systems that people do have a substantial ability to sort of adapt their travel behavior. But we have also seen that the majority of people after this disruption has chose to or has been unable to sustain that changed travel behavior. So a lot of people have gone back to the behavior they had before the disruption. If that would be the case after the pandemic, it's too early to say. But one of the things being discussed right now, of course, and related to this is whether working from home will have a large impact on travel after the pandemic. And we have seen, of course, an increased maturity in using digital tools for working from home and organizing distance meetings. And many surveys indicate that people would like to continue to work from home also after the pandemic, maybe 2 to 3 days a week. We have seen that many jobs that, for example, I think we calculated some 40% of the jobs in the Stockholm region are of a kind that could fit for distance work, which means that 60% of the jobs are of a different kind. And how many jobs that could be able to do on distance varies in different cities due to the sort of the labor markets and so on. It's not obvious, however, that more working from home will reduce travel altogether. There might be some rebound effects here. People might sort of travel less to work, but increase their leisure time travel instead. For example, we might see relocations where people tend to, over time, move further away from their jobs, further away from public transport hubs, etc., when it becomes less important to be able to move to job at a daily basis. And that might also increase or decrease the importance of public transport. So working from home comes both with opportunities and challenges for a sustainable mobility shift, I would say. But there are a number of uncertainties here, and in order to foster more structured discussion with industry people and practitioners working with public transport and around public transport, we have designed 4 scenarios for the near future. So with the near future, we talk about the coming 5 years or so. And we have developed these scenarios based on 2 different dimensions. One is the level of demand. Will demand return to the pre-pandemic levels, or will we see a more permanent decrease in demand for public transport? The other dimension is related to if we will see a structural change when it comes to public transport and the public transport industry. And here we have a low level of structural change compared to a higher level of structural change. And I will go through these 4 scenarios a little bit more in detail. So the first scenario we call return, and this is quite an obvious scenario because in here we assume that things pretty much go back to the way they were before the pandemic. So people will pretty quickly after the distance restrictions are lifted, go back and travel the way they did before. And we will also see in this scenario that politicians are prepared to put in the extra subsidies needed to make public transport run on the same levels as they did before the pandemic. So pretty much everything will be as it was before. Another scenario we call downtown spiral, and here we see a lower demand for public transport also in the longer term. And people will refrain from public transport because for different reasons. More people working from home is one such reason. And in this scenario, politicians are not prepared or are unable to put in the extra subsidies needed to continue to support public transport on the same level as before. And we will therefore see a reduced demand, but also a lower level of revenues and a decrease in supply of public transport. And what will happen in this scenario is that the lines and the times during the day, which has less riders, will be the ones that disappear first. And this will create a downward spiral for public transport. Another scenario, which also assumes lower level of demands for public transport, we call new mobility services. So also here we see that public transport will reduce its supply, but what will happen here instead is that those trips will be replaced by new mobility services like shared cars, bicycling, etc. So new types of services that we didn't see before, and also that politicians and the governments are here putting in both efforts and money into subsidizing these types of new services. And the fourth scenario, finally, we call public transport as a backbone. And here we see a return of ridership to similar levels as before the pandemic. But on top of that, we see a situation where governments, especially at local and regional level, are taking the opportunity to do changes and innovations in a way that supports more integrated system of public transport with other types of sustainable mobility services. Combined with more working from home, this will make the cities and regions less car dependent, and people will, in a larger extent, travel without private car. So, with these four scenarios as a point of departure, we have had discussions with people working inside the public transportation system, like people coming from public transport agencies, the operators, but also with people working with new mobility solutions, working with local governments responsible for land use planning, etc. And we have tried to discuss what are the possible roles and strategies that are needed for the future in this situation. And I will just try to talk about a couple of them, a couple of the ideas that we have harvested from these discussions. One is that there is a need to redefine what public transport really is about and what should be included in the concept public transport, so to say. And here we see a need for an opening up the concept to include more types of shared mobility solutions, so that the toolboxes of the public transport agencies, not least, is widened, and that you have more tools at your disposals, not only working with buses, trains, trams, metros, the traditional public transport modes, but also include other modes of transportation like shared scooters, bicycles, cars, etc. The second bullet point here is about sort of making sure that the different actors and the different mobility providers are not competing with each other first and foremost, but that you find really complementary solutions, and that the traditional public transport are utilizing the new mobility services that are available. And in order to do that, there is a need to distribute the roles between these different actors, so that they are not competing, but rather complementing each other. And the third thing here is that there is a strong need now to incentivize innovation and collaboration, because the challenges that we are facing are very difficult for single actors to handle on their own. There is a need to involve all types of actors in innovation and renewal, if we should take the opportunities that are at hand in this very unique situation. And especially important, we believe, is for the public transport agencies to incentivize the operators, those who are closer to the passengers, to really innovate and renew their services to make them attractive for people in this new era. Finally, some findings and some recommendations related to funding, because funding is sort of a key issue and a key challenge in this time. And funding is a double-sided coin. It's both about revenues, but it's as much about costs. And we do believe that there is a unique opportunity now to flatten the curve, which means to reduce the peak hour traffic, to try to implement solutions that reduces peak hour, and that will save a lot of costs in public transport, and is perhaps the most important thing that can be done at the moment. And how can you do that? Well, you can work with better transport traffic information related to, for example, congestion in public transport, but perhaps more importantly, work with new ticket and price mechanism and price strategies with giving incentives for people to travel off peak periods during the day. We also think there is an opportunity to work with more better sort of broadened base for funding, and try to look into earmarked road usage charging, both to make road usage more efficient and reduce congestion, but also at the same time increase the revenue streams for investments in public transport and other types of sustainable mobility options. And the third point here, and the final point I would like to make, is about renew the perception of public commitment. So start a discussion about what public transport agencies really can fund. Is it only the traditional buses, or should they open up to also fund other types of mobility in their cities and regions? Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions, comments, or reflections.
Thank you very much, John. That was an extremely interesting presentation. We will collect all the comments and thoughts and take questions at the end.
Okay.
So we will move now to the second presentation, and we have two presenters. We started with a European presenter. Now we shall have a Oceania and America presentation jointly done by Paul Minett and John Niles. Paul Minett is a transport researcher based in Auckland, New Zealand. He's managing director of Tripconvergence Limited, which was established in 2004 to leverage insights into transportation. He's also a research associate with the Mineta Transportation Institute in San Jose, California. He earned a Master of Business Administration from the University of Auckland in 1993 and has over 15 years research interests in the methods for reducing traffic, with particular focus on encouraging multi-passenger travel, and has completed several research projects in this area. He is also co-founder of both the Ride Sharing Institute and the Ride Sharing Subcommittee of the US Transportation Research Board. His co-part presenter, John Niles, is president of Global Telematics, an independent policy research and developing consultancy that he founded in Seattle to create policies, educational programs, and actions for cost-effective and sustainable transportation improvement. He is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has graduated in mathematical physics, and at Carnegie Mellon University's Graduate School of Industrial Administration, where he focused on operations research for transportation. He's a 20-year non-resident research associate at the Mineta Transportation Institute. He studied and reported on transport-oriented development, urban freight planning, incremental bus, rapid transit, electric motorcycles, park and ride analysis, job creation from infrastructure construction, and pandemic-related justifications for microtransit expansion. So the two gentlemen will make a joint presentation on using incentives to rebuild passenger counts and defeat post-COVID congestion. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Good day, everyone. My name's Paul Minett, and I'm talking to you from Auckland, New Zealand. With me, virtually, is my friend and colleague John Niles from Seattle in the Pacific Northwest of the USA. The title of our presentation is Using Incentives to Rebuild Passenger Counts and Defeat Post-COVID Congestion. We are both research associates with the Mineta Transportation Institute in San Jose, California, and we collaborated with Professor Richard Lee and graduate research assistant Brittany Bogue at Mineta to carry out a project called Congestion Clearing Payments to Passengers, funded by the US Department of Transportation. Today, we're going to share with you some highlights of that project and relate it to the potential issue of excess traffic congestion in the post-COVID era. First, some background. At peak commute times, many of the world's highways are jammed with low occupancy vehicles. A high proportion of these trips go to similar destinations and could be pulled together if people really wanted to reduce the traffic. Failure to pool trips results in huge amounts of traffic congestion. Traffic congestion contributes to wasted time and fuel, pollution, and carbon emissions, reduced economic growth, and demand for additional highway lanes. People leave home early and get home late. Quality of life is impacted. Still, people don't pool their trips or take public transport. Why not? One important answer that it's not worth the effort and inconvenience involved in traveling as a passenger. The deal is not good enough. COVID has exacerbated this situation as commuters have switched away from public transport in significant numbers. It may be challenging to get previously passenger commuters who have newly switched to being drivers back to passenger travel in the post-COVID era. Our pre-pandemic project, Congestion Clearing Payments to Passengers, asked people how much effort it would take for them to travel as a passenger and how much money it would take, if someone was prepared to pay them, to offset that effort and the inconvenience. And for those who would not travel as a passenger for any amount of money, would they give someone else a ride? No one has ever really asked this question in this way before. Our intention was to develop and test a method for finding out if enough people would travel as passengers, if the deal were right, to get rid of the congestion and keep it away. If enough people would do it, the intention was to find out how beneficial it would be across a number of important dimensions, including saved commute time, increased access to employment opportunities, reduced vehicle miles traveled, reduced emissions, and more, and how much it would cost to achieve. We looked at prior research that considered paying people incentives to travel as passengers. We obtained and evaluated traffic data for several congested highway corridors in California. We held focus group meetings with people who travel in congested traffic to find out what would be important to them. We developed a survey and administered it to a sample of people who use a particularly busy road in California to find out about their trips, what impact the congestion has on them, what they would do if the congestion went away, if they'd consider traveling as a passenger to help reduce the traffic, if so, how much effort they perceive it would involve for them to travel as a passenger in the key alternative modes of bus, vanpool, carpool, and shared ride hail, and how much money it would take to offset that effort and get them to travel as a passenger. We analyzed the responses to the survey, modeled the impact on the traffic over 20 years, and estimated the total benefits and costs for the solution on the route as a case study. The published report describes all aspects of the method that we developed. John will tell you about the case study findings.
Thanks, Paul. What we found is that if the deal were right, which would be up to $15 US per day for our California study route in 2019, half the people, repeat half, who use that busy road would be traveling as passengers. About half of the remainder would be willing to give rides. The last quarter only want to drive alone by themselves. But for sure, enough people would travel as passengers if the deal were right to get rid of the congestion on that route we studied. But we found from the modeling, the congestion would come back. In the current traffic, 88% of commuters are departing home at a time that is not preferred by them. Once the congestion was gone, this significant proportion of commuters would change the time they leave home in the morning, creating new congestion at a slightly later time than before. For the whole intervention to be successful, an additional reward would be needed to encourage people to leave home early. We estimated the dollar value of the many benefits of getting rid of that congestion on that busy highway in California. We also estimated the total costs of getting rid of congestion by this method, including the incentive for traveling as a passenger and the incentive for going early for the same 20-year period. We selected a 20-year cost-benefit evaluation period to match the usual period analyzed for justifying highway projects. Now, the quantified benefits exceeded the costs by $500 million 2019 US dollars, with $4.50 of benefit for every dollar of cost. Benefit to cost ratio, 4.5 to 1. Now, technology applications utilizing smartphones and connected to the wireless cloud already exist to enable this solution. There are now apps that provide gold standard occupancy verification with algorithms to detect fraudulent trip and occupancy claims. The benefits of this approach include emissions reductions, very important for air quality and greenhouse gas reduction both. The case study found carbon emission reductions of 181,000 tons over 20 years. And if viewed only from a carbon reduction perspective, the congestion reduction solution that comes out here would have co-benefits of $2,800 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent removed. Paul will now outline the implications of this for policy and practice.
Thanks, John. Our project report provides a method for estimating the benefits and costs of a permanent program of paying people to travel as passengers to remove congestion. We think it makes sense to use existing private and public vehicles and existing road infrastructure as much as possible, and this should be an important policy position. The policy would go on to require 3 additional concepts. First, that when evaluating proposed infrastructure expansion projects, require development of a no-build pay incentives alternative for comparison purposes. Our project provides a method for developing such an alternative. Second, that where congestion pricing proposals are having difficulty making progress, require that incentives be considered as a reverse tolls alternative. Our project provides a method for modeling the impacts of incentives. And third, where there's significant ongoing congestion at bottleneck locations, but neither facility expansion nor congestion pricing are under consideration, require evaluation of the use of incentives to passengers to manage the traffic congestion effectively. Our project provides a method for evaluating the flows of traffic through a bottleneck and modeling the impacts of incentives. Perhaps it goes without saying, but there needs to be a source of funding for the incentives, and to the extent this is public money, policy settings will be required to enable funds to be used in this way. Subsequent to completion of our project, the Congestion Clearing Payments to Passengers project, and building on the underlying concepts, I did some work with Patrick de Corla Souza from the FHWA in Washington, D.C. He suggested a paper in which we combined congestion clearing payments to passengers concepts with congestion pricing concepts to define a solution that would provide both a carrot and a stick. Congestion pricing would provide the funds, while incentives would encourage desirable mode choices by commuters. Variable pricing would remove the need for a go early bonus. Our modeling showed that about half the revenue from congestion pricing would go to funding the incentives, while the other half could be available for other transportation purposes. This appears to be a viable alternative solution that would also require particular policy settings to enable its use. We recognize that our approach and evaluation method is new and needs more testing, whether it's for congestion clearing payments to passengers alone or in combination with congestion pricing. Prior to implementing an incentives regime, we recommend that our evaluation method be applied to further locations to provide additional case studies. However, as soon as practicable, we would like to see a pilot project that implements the use of incentives on the case study or other routes so that we can match real costs to the estimated costs for proof of concept. We are calling for jurisdictions that would like to test this idea to get in touch so we can start developing proposals. This will be particularly important in the post-COVID period. John will talk through our thoughts on how this should apply. John?
Thanks, Paul. Turning now to the aftermath of the COVID-19 tragedy, financial incentives to increase the proportion of road travelers riding as passengers are likely to have multiple benefits. First, traffic volumes and vehicle kilometers traveled will be reduced. Second, there will be distributive impacts from incentives paid to individuals for taking the desired action, that is, traveling as a passenger, including some equity implications. Thirdly, the previously mentioned reduction in carbon emissions. Persons not wishing to risk traveling on public transport might well be prepared to travel with a known group of vaccinated persons in a carpool. Our evaluation method, especially the survey tool, should be used on congested roads to discover the post-COVID predisposition of people to travel as passengers, their perceptions of effort involved in taking alternative modes, and the amount of incentive required to overcome that effort. This might be higher because we will also be overcoming the perceived risk of shared passenger travel, so there could be a premium. We can expect that as people adjust to the post-COVID environment, such a premium would decline. At any rate, surveying in this way would inform the setting of budgets for congestion clearing payments to passengers in the post-COVID era and the expected benefit to cost ratio for each congested route tested. Paul, time is almost up. Do you have any concluding remarks?
Thanks, John. Where we started from was that we expect traffic congestion to be worse in the post-pandemic era, and that our work on congestion clearing payments to passengers might be relevant. Incentives would have multiple benefits, encouraging people to resume or even increase the rate at which they travel as passengers. We talked about our evaluation methodology and the results of our case study in California. We suggested that policy settings should be to maximize the use of existing infrastructure and vehicles, and a policy of what we have termed reverse tolls is a potential mechanism for achieving that. We suggested that our survey and evaluation methods should be used to find out the propensity of people on crowded routes to travel as passengers as we come out of the pandemic, and that this information be used to inform setting budgets for managing congestion by use of incentives. I think that's everything. So we'll turn control back to the moderator and look forward to answering any questions or providing clarification about the content of our presentation. Robert?
Oh, John, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation there. So I will jump immediately to our third presenter, Xiaohe Zhang. I apologize if I've not pronounced your name correctly. Is a PhD student in the College of Architecture and Urban Planning at Tongji University, China. She's undertaking research into urban traffic planning and management, and specifically how COVID-19 pandemic has affected people's commute and travel behaviors in Shanghai. So, Xiaohe, the floor is yours to give us a presentation on the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on commuting in Metro Shanghai. Please.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, I will share my slides. Okay, hello everyone. I'm very pleased to attend this forum. My name is Xiaohe Zhang. I'm a PhD candidate in the College of Architecture and Urban Planning in Tongji University. The topic of my presentation is the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on commuting travel and metro passenger flow in Shanghai. Firstly, I will introduce the background of my research. The COVID-19 pandemic is a major challenge for the entire global community at this moment. In China, the COVID-19 was appeared in December 2019 and spread widely from mid-January 2020. At that time, China's most grand festival, the Spring Festival, was coming, and there would be a massive flow of people across the country. Well, it means people that working in big cities will come back to their hometown for a family reunion and celebrate the Chinese Lunar New Year. In order to reduce the spread of the virus, strict lockdown policy has been applied all over China to reduce non-essential trips outside. People are advised to stay at home and keep social distance. Due to the duties and nature of different jobs, some people have to commute as usual to maintain the fundamental function of the city. Some people work remotely from home. In addition to the changes in work pattern, travel behavior has also changed. So I want to explore the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on work, travel behavior, and public transportation ridership, then accumulate experience and provide suggestions for urban planning, land use, and transportation operation, which is conducive to the construction of resilient city in the future. There are 4 issues that I focus on in my research. How has the epidemic changed people's working patterns? How did COVID-19 lockdown measures affect people's commuting behavior aspects, such as mode choice, trip distance, trip duration, etc.? How has COVID-19 impacted passenger flow of public transportation? How has ridership varied spatio-temporally? How can the above observations help us form new policy implications and build a more robust and resilient city in the event of future pandemics or other emergencies? There are 2 types of data we used for analysis. We did a questionnaire survey in Shanghai, including social demographic characteristics, commuting travel behavior before and during the pandemic, perceptions, and location information. Another data source is the passenger volume data of Shanghai Metro Line 2. This data includes people's entry station and final destination. 4 time periods were analyzed because in Spring Festival 2020, China has experienced the worst time of the epidemic. After 2 months of hard work in April 2020, the epidemic was effectively controlled and people's lives come back to normal. So it is significant to compare the 2 periods in 2020 and 2019. Then I will introduce my research in 4 parts. The first part is people's work pattern and characteristics, and the first question will be solved in this part. This figure is the work pattern during the lockdown. 27% of the people can totally work from home. 30% of the people still have to commute as usual. 23% of the people are in hybrid mode. They sometimes commute, sometimes telecommute. Then I compared the characteristics of commuting people and the telecommuting people. This is the age distribution. People who need to commute are mostly aged between 30 and 39, while people who work from home are mostly aged between 18 and 29. It is obvious that people who commute as usual are relatively elderly on average than people who work from home. As for dwelling condition, commuters are more likely to live with family members and less likely to live alone or share flats. From the perspective of annual household income, compared with telecommuters, there are more low-income people and less high-income people in commuters, but the proportion of middle-income people is similar for the two groups. As for car ownership, commuters have lower car ownership because there are more low-income people among commuters, and they are less likely to own a car. In addition, there are also differences in the mood of commuters and telecommuters during the pandemic. Commuters are prone to have more negative emotions and fewer positive ones. They are more likely to feel anxious and worried. This graph illustrates the industry of commuters and telecommuters. People working in medical care, transportation, administrative institutions, and manufacturing industries need to commute most because their work has played an important role in keeping the city's fundamentals functioning well during the lockdown, and their work can hardly be done by telecommuting, and they are labeled as essential service staff. From the above, we can conclude that commuters face a greater risk of being infected by the virus due to more contact with people, and a greater risk of bringing the virus to family because they are more likely to live with family members. Their job responsibilities are important in keeping the city's fundamental functioning well. Thus, their commuting conditions deserve our attention. So in part 2, I will introduce people's commuting behaviors before and during the pandemic. During the pandemic, the top 3 travel modes of commuting are private car, electric bicycle, and metro. And this figure shows the contrast of every travel mode before and after the outbreak of the COVID-19. The proportion of bicycle, electric bicycle, and private car is increased, which are all personal mobility. Others are decreased, but we can see that the percentage of decrease or increase is slight. In other words, there were not a lot of people abandoning their previous travel modes. Compared with the metro passenger flow data, the metro ridership dropped by more than 70% during the pandemic. But the proportion of passengers who have to commute by metro hasn't changed much. A possible reason is that commuters do not have enough alternative modes. They have to rely on public transportation to go to work. And this is people's commuting distance. 90% of them had no change in their commuting distance. 7% commute longer, while 3% commutes shorter, which is mainly due to the changes in travel modes. This is a commuting distance curve of different travel modes. As we can see from this figure, walking is a predominant mode within 2.5 kilometers. Bicycle and e-bicycle plays a greater role within 3 to 6 kilometers. For long-distance travel, people mainly rely on metro and private car. And next is commuting trip duration. Metro accounted for the largest share of commutes over an hour. Although private car also undertakes a lot of long-distance travels, but trip duration is much less than metro. We compared the average commuting distance of metro and private car. The average commuting distance is about the same, but the trip duration varies greatly. The main reason is the traffic volume on the road has decreased a lot than before. The roads are free from congestion, so the speed of driving a car is much faster than before. We compared the car ownership and accessibility to metro stations of metro users. For people with longer commuting trip duration, car ownership become lower, and metro station accessibility is getting poorer. They usually live in the suburb of the city with poor metro accessibility, but they have to rely on public transportation to commute. Thus, it is also necessary to pay attention to the vulnerable groups to promote social equity. This table shows the proportion of the change in commuting trip duration. The diagonal of the table represents the proportion of unchanged commuting time. And for the changed part, we find that people with shorter commuting duration before are more likely to experience increased time during the pandemic, while people with previously long commutes are more likely to experience reduced time. The reason for the increase in time may be that many entrances and exits of residential communities were closed during the pandemic, and leaving only one entrance or exit for the convenience of management. And people who passing through the entrance and exit must be checked for the temperature. Therefore, people working or riding to work had to spend more time inside the community. As for time reduction, we found that almost all of them were car users. This result also proves that congestion was eased during the pandemic. In part 3, I will introduce the characteristics of metro passenger flow. Shanghai Metro Line 2 is an analytical object. As a major line through Shanghai from east to west, it runs through the city center. There are several employment centers along this route, so it is the best choice to be used for analysis. In Spring Festival 2020, the average passenger flow reduction rate is 77.2% compared to the 2019 Spring Festival. Trips for pleasure, tourists, and entertainment have been cancelled a lot, so the main purpose of those trips is to commute, and the passenger flow of commuting group is relatively stable. Although the overall passenger flow has declined a lot, it is not homogeneous in spatial distribution. This is a scattered diagram of passenger flow of Shanghai Metro Line 2 during Spring Festival 2020 and Spring Festival 2019. Except for some special transportation hubs, we find that even during the pandemic, the passenger flow of some stations is still much higher than that of other stations, such as East Nanjing Road Station, Central Avenue Station, People's Square Station. And we further analyzed the passenger flow of different stations. The X label represents the normal passenger flow of the station. The Y label represents the passenger reduction rate. According to passenger flow and reduction rate, these stations are divided into 4 types: high passenger flow, high reduction rate; high passenger flow, low reduction rate; low passenger flow, high reduction rate; and low passenger flow, low reduction rate. This picture shows the spatial distribution of the 4 type metro stations, which were marked by different symbols and colors. We selected 6 high passenger flow stations, and they are all located in urban centers. And we also draw the cumulative distribution curve for all the distance of passengers. It can be seen that the biggest differences among 4 periods were found in the 50th percentile of the distance distribution. On the whole, the 50th percentile distance reduction is 2.5 kilometers, and the overall reduction rate is 16.2%. More specifically, for the 6 large passenger flow stations, most of the stations' 50th percentile distance decline is higher than average. Among the 6 stations, Lujiazui Station was the most affected, with a reduction rate nearly twice of the mean value. As the financial center of Shanghai, Lujiazui has an ultra-high density of office buildings. The financial and the commercial functions are concentrated in a high-intensive space. It can be seen that Lujiazui district also has the highest sensitivity to the impact of the pandemic. So the enlightenment is that the high concentration of business functions may not necessarily lead to the optimal travel efficiency, but will show a lack of resilience in the face of some shocks. In the future, the area and density of office buildings could be appropriately controlled in the urban center. And in part 4, I would like to provide some suggestions for different stakeholders. For mode choice in the post-pandemic era, people would opt more for personal mobility, and this trend will continue in the post-pandemic period. It is necessary to adapt the development of public transportation to people's travel demands under the new normal. The soft mobility, like bicycles, electric bicycles, should be privileged and guaranteed, which have played an irreplaceable role in the pandemic. For city planning and land use, telecommuting may become a new trend in the future. People's telecommuting needs should be considered more in community planning. Some shared office spaces could be set up in combination with libraries and function rooms within the community. Proper control of office space and increase of residential area in urban central areas is necessary. More attention should be paid to mix the function of land use so that the office and living needs can be organically combined. For rail transit operation and planning, transit agencies are highly suggested to flexibly adjust their services according to the real-time ridership in different time periods and segments. The frequency of the service in the rush hour and some high passenger flow stations should be increased to avoid overcrowding and keep social distance. For vulnerable groups, their accessibility to the metro station needs to be improved. For essential workers such as medical support staff and some important occupations in keeping the city's basic function, on-demand services which can offer door-to-door transportation should be provided. And the above is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Xiaohe. That's very interesting and extremely valuable to have such empirical evidence of the situation. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've had 3 very interesting presentations from 3 different continents, different perspectives on the way forward. So now's the possibility to ask some questions. First of all, I should have also said that Paul and John have circulated a poll for all of you listeners to participate in at your leisure. You don't have to do it immediately there, but they would greatly appreciate if you would like to contribute to that as well. You connect through the system, of course. I'll start the ball rolling by asking a couple of questions myself first. I'll start with John Hultén. Thank you very much. On your presentation there, you focused on the various different scenarios there. One of the conclusions that you came to was that it would be desirable to redefine public transport and readjust the distribution of the roles of provision of public transport. My question is, that sounds great in theory, but how do we achieve that in practice there? Because is it not sadly the case there that the existing transport providers just want to continue providing the bus services that they've always done, and the new entrants by their very nature, disruptive in nature in order to get in the market in the first place. And so they may not even see any benefit from cooperating. How or who it should be responsible for trying to have the kind of cooperation that you propose? John.
Well, first of all, I think public transport is not an end in itself. It's not an end in itself to run buses or trains or metros or whatever. It is done by a purpose to achieve something. And I think that has to be the point of departure. And if you take that as a point of departure, it is not self-evident that the public transport agency's aim is to provide as much public transport as possible or force everyone to ride in their vehicles. It can be much better for the society and for also the public taxpayers that people are actually choosing other alternatives than traveling by a bus or by a metro. So, and I think that is sort of a different perspective and a different angle that is needed in among the public transport agencies to see that these new type of solutions can actually be of benefit. If we can reduce people traveling very short distances with the metro and they can use an e-scooter instead, is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. So I think that is the perspective you could have on this. How to make this happen? It's of course, it's not an easy thing to do, but it has to start with a notion of collaboration and dialogue. And I think the public sector has to sort of take an important first step towards that.
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. Paul, John, fascinating piece of research you've done there. I must admit, I was a bit shocked there when you say even when people are offered theoretically $15 a day to share, still a quarter of the people don't want to share there. It shows how antisocial human beings can be there, even because $15 seems quite an attractive amount of money. My general question is there, the US is always had a far more advanced or far different approach than Europe as regards to sort of road tolling and high occupancy vehicle lanes and the like. And yet your paper's still saying that has not really been effective. There's still too much congestion there. I'm just wondering how to square the circle a little bit there, because again, from a European perspective, I would have thought that the efforts that are done by US cities in road pricing, on whether it's on bridges or roads or encouraging high occupancy lanes, would have had an effect. But you're saying that even with those, it's not been effective there. Could you perhaps explain how you see that has happened?
John, shall I pick that up? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can, Paul. You go ahead.
Yeah. So it's been very effective in some places. Some places, those high occupancy vehicle lanes are very, very full of high occupancy vehicles. Mostly HOV2, but in some cases HOV3, and it depends how long it's been there and how things have developed in the culture. To the east of Los Angeles, for example, there's a tidal flow HOV3 lane that is very full. So it would be wrong to say they're not successful. However, they have failed to be successful in some cases, and at the moment there's an effort ongoing in a lot of places where they're switching from HOV to express lanes, where they're charging a toll to use the lane if you're a single occupant vehicle and filling up that capacity. So there's a bit of both. And I think the real thing is that the toll itself maybe has an impact on deterring some use. That doesn't necessarily encourage people to do the alternate use. And I think squaring the circle is an interesting way of putting it. It's the mystery. It's the mystery is what does it take to actually, on a long-term basis, get people to travel as passengers more? And we haven't cracked that, I think, anywhere. John?
I don't have much to add except to say a couple of things are difficult. One, there's a lot of variation across America. A lot of the different cities, what may happen in one place is different than what happens in another. The other is we haven't totally shaken out at this stage the effect of the pandemic. Unlike in New Zealand and perhaps China, as I understand that, the pandemic is very much ongoing, both in the United States and in Canada, to name the two North American places I know about. And I think there's just a lot that remains to be seen. It's a very dynamic situation. We certainly have incentive systems in place, as you point out, Robert, in the form of high occupancy. We call them high occupancy toll lanes now. We've got some lanes where they just continually raise the price in a computer-based dynamic fashion to a very high level to keep them free flowing. And if you're highly paid and need to get to work and have plenty of money in your bank account, you can pay $10 or $15 or $20 to get a quick ride and just fly by traffic. It's also true that if you live near a metro station in a big city and you work near a metro station in a big city, you can get to work very, very quickly. But that's not the general situation in America. We have suburban sprawl is ongoing. People are seeking more space and cheaper space to live, and the jobs are everywhere, and we have dual working families, and one partner goes in one direction, one goes in the other, and it's very difficult to optimize to get that fast ride. And we're going to have to look at the statistics coming out now. I mean, the whole landscape has changed in North America. What people are doing, as was pointed out, more telecommuting. We were thinking we're going to see a lot more people going in late. We're getting very good traffic information now. The cameras are everywhere, and you can find out what your trip is going to be like. So if there's bad congestion, a lot of which is caused by accidents, breakdowns, etc., people will just go in later. But we certainly have a lot of places with bottlenecks, just structural bottlenecks in the road, and that's the kind of thing that Paul and I are talking about. How do you mitigate that?
Thank you. Xiaohe, thank you very much for your presentation. Extremely fascinating. A first question for you, there, perhaps a very simplistic one there, but given that China is ahead of the curve in coming out of the COVID crisis, I was a bit shocked to see that your statistics are showing that metro ridership is still down 77% there compared with April 2020 there. Do you see that there is a recovery coming for the metro ridership in Shanghai?
Well, the whole metro ridership has decreased 77%, but for commuters, some commuters, they have to rely on public transportation because they do not have a car. So for these people, the reduction rate is not changed than before.
Okay. And a second question there from your presentation there, did I understand correctly that one of your conclusions, which is interesting, in simple terms, you were saying the concentration of businesses in the city centre is probably too high there, and a long-term solution will be that city planners don't have such densities of businesses in a single area. Is that correct?
Well, I think the telecommuting may be a new trend in the post-COVID era. So in the future, people may go to work 2 to 3 days a week, and the rest of the time they work from home. So, so maybe we control the density in the city area. Maybe it's a good way for people to keep social distance. That is my own opinion.
Good, thank you. Okay, I'll throw questions open now to all of you, and of course, please feel free if you want to come in with your own comments as well at any stage there. but to any of you there, we're discussing here obviously about the recovery of public transport post-COVID. The discussion focuses very largely on work commuting. Are we then therefore saying that public transport, the primary role of public transport is just to get people to and from work, and it's not really something that's for recreational or leisure or private use there? Because what one could interpret that if our focus is just on getting people to and from the office or factory or whatever.
Well, if I may comment, I think that's a very good question, and I think public transport planners has been very much engaged with commuting to and from jobs, to and from schools, perhaps too much. I think we have seen over recent years that what actually increases more is leisure travel. And I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, my intervention is that there might be an effect of increased working from home, might be that people are, instead of doing the commuting, they are increasing their leisure traveling instead, because you have more resources, time and money to spend on other types of traveling. So I think that is a huge challenge for public transport to meet a more flexible demand, which is necessary when it comes to leisure travel.
John, please.
It's certainly public policy on the west coast of the United States anyway, and I'm talking about Seattle and the big cities in California, to try to rebuild communities around all more trip purposes. The idea, something that's growing in California and Seattle, is going from transit-oriented development to transit-oriented communities, where you actually expand the circle, control cars a bit more to a greater distance from the mainline transit stations, encourage the use of soft modes to get there, in particular try to support event venues with transit. In Seattle, I think has found some success in putting transit stations, emerging light rail, putting the stations near the baseball stadium, the football stadium, soccer. It's been they get a lot of ridership for that. So I'd say events and just focusing on non-work travel is definitely a trend I've seen in at least the west coast of the United States, and I think worth doing, especially as the peak commuting travel finds ways to moderate, right? People don't need to go so much in peak if possible. Still in all, we're still seeing enough peak congestion. Paul and I are seeing that we think our solution is important to explore.
Absolutely. That leads then on to the sort of next question there, that with these changing travel patterns, what is the most efficient way that public transport providers, whether it's the companies themselves or whether it's the regional, national, local government authorities, what is the best way that they can get the necessary information to develop the transport networks so that they reflect the traffic flows of today and tomorrow, and not the traffic flows historically there? We know the number 12 bus always goes the same route for the last 50 years there, and not necessarily reflects what the needs of today are there. What is the best way, if you're a public transport planner, how can you get that information? What would you suggest, ladies and gentlemen? Please, John.
I'm very impressed with the new simulation capabilities that are developing. We have this idea that comes out of other industries called the digital twin. Simulations have a reputation, and some of them, I mean, ITF has sponsored some of them or been involved in some. They often present as kind of one-time events where you with complicated modeling. I think if the world, if you like, the transportation specialists can develop ongoing simulations that monitor and so to speak, digital twin is the phrase to use. Mm-hmm. And I actually think some of that, they're thinking about that down in Paul's territory down in New Zealand and Australia. I think Paul is starting to get involved in that. I'll throw it to him. Are you seeing some interest in digital twins and simulation, Paul, and your smart city work down there?
Well, I've heard the term and I've seen the paper. I'm somewhat skeptical, I guess. I mean, I'm interested in what we do. The question is, to what extent what's there drives what happens, and therefore, you know, what leads what. You know, for example, a new train route will inevitably cause some change in the shape of the city as people decide to use the train route. Sometimes we don't get the development we hope for. So I'm not sure about the answer to that question. There was a company called Bridge, BRIDJ, set up in the US that I was familiar with, and they were using Google Maps data to identify O&D pairs that weren't being served, and they were implementing shuttles to meet the needs of those O&D pairs. They are no longer in business, to the best of my knowledge. So I think, you know, one of the huge issues is, I want to use this opportunity to go back to your starting out point, Robert, where you said you found it hard to believe people would say, no, I won't do something for $15. Of course, we didn't ask the question that way. We only asked the people how much if they had indicated they would be interested in being a passenger. Because there's no point asking a person who's, you know, the road warrior who only wants to drive his car if he'll, you know, how much of an incentive it'll take, because he's not interested. And I think that was the critical piece. And I liked what John had, John's information, where you're looking and saying, you know, what are people prepared to do as a starting point? And I love the fact that that John thinks that public transport is there for other purposes in providing public transport. I'm afraid the realistic view from around the world is got to be that there's a lot of them that are there for the purposes of, you know, the goal is to have more public transport. I would like to say more passenger transport, and let's get away from the big rolling stock. And we've created polycentric cities, and we just got so much stuff going in so many different directions that it's very difficult to answer your question in a way that delivers services that make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
I'll stop there.
Yeah. John, you want to come back in?
I would also make the point about big...
Other John.
I'm sorry, John. You go ahead, sir. I've been talking too much.
No. I don't know which John you meant, actually, Robert.
Sorry, I'm too polite. Carry on.
Okay, then. No, I think you asked about data and how we can know what people need in the future. I think we've seen a couple of interesting things during the pandemic. How, for example, we can use mobile phone data to understand how people are actually moving around. It's on a rather, you know, overall level, but still it's been used to understand some sort of behaviors during the pandemic, which I think is interesting. We also see new types of travel service, which are not, you know, based on pen and paper as they used to be, but are based on apps, so that you actually people are actually revealing how they are traveling with the mobile phones, and then you are adding questions to that, providing a better understanding, I think. So, and there are also, of course, a number of more revealed preferences coming out from data from mobile phones and movements and so on. So I think there is a lot of new types of data that we can use to understand better what people really want and how we can support them in moving around the cities and regions.
Oh,
Robert, somebody in the chat has asked why we haven't answered the questions of the audience, and I have a feeling perhaps you can't see the question of the audience.
That may be it, though. Do you want to read out one of the questions, Paul, then, please?
So Torben says to Xiaohe, I understood that you noticed a higher use of private vehicles like bicycles, e-bikes, and cars. Will this change now the strategy of Shanghai to promote sustainable mobility in the future? Will that change the strategy?
Well, now more and more people are using the bicycles and scooters, because they think it's a good way to commute, and it is very convenient because we have many the shared bicycles in the street. So a lot of people are using the shared bicycles and the shared e-bicycles to commute. And maybe in the future, I think we should provide more bicycle lanes for them to provide a safer environment to ride. Well, that is my answer. Thank you.
Would you like me to read another one out, Robert?
Please, Paul.
Okay, sure. We have one for John Hultén about, sorry, I'm just having trouble getting it to move here, about flatten the curve. Are there any peak pricing schemes in cities in practice today? Are you aware of? What are a good higher ticket prices for peak hours? Is it plus or minus? Is it plus 50%, or lower prices in off-peak hours? Is it minus 50%? Or should the price difference be much higher? In Germany, we often have free ride offers for partners of monthly pass holders in the evenings or on the weekends.
Well, in Sweden, we don't have any schemes at the moment with price differentiated with price differentiation. It is discussed, has been discussed, but it's politically quite difficult to implement, because there will always be some people that suffer from having to pay a higher price and who has not the possibility to travel outside the peak. So it's a very sensitive issue, and some way around that might be to, instead of increasing the price in peak, lowering the price off peak, and you can achieve some similar effect. However, then you also have an additional cost, and that could to some, or exactly, you reduce the revenues, and that could be perhaps be handled with also reduced in costs. But yeah, it's not an easy issue. It's politically sensitive, but I think there is a unique opportunity now, because it would make sense for many ways to introduce more differentiated price mechanisms.
I think we can take one more question though before we run out of time. Paul, can you read out one more? Your microphone's not on.
Do that. Okay. Yeah, there was one other question, and that was a great presentation. I think this was in response to John Hultén's speech. Thank you. In a country like India, there's an increase in purchase of two-wheelers and cars due to the pandemic. While we think about improving public transport, how can we also address this? And I think that was fairly early in the hour. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's always very important to understand the context, and the context is so very different in our different countries and different cities. Also within a small country as Sweden, the context is very different from a city like Stockholm compared to the people living in smaller cities and so on. But in general, I think the challenge now, and one of the challenges now, is to provide public transport that is attractive for those who changed cars, but those who changed to two-wheelers like bicycle, I mean, they should continue to go by bike if possible. So I think you should support them as much as possible to sort of stay with that alternative, because that is good for many reasons, for health, for costs, and for accessibility and less congestion in our cities. So that is a huge challenge right now, to find that balance.
Just to add on that last point there, you're absolutely right, John, there. But I think too much energy is focused on modal shifts between different types of public transport. The reality is all the forms of public transport, whether it's cycling or even walking or buses or metros, they should all be combining to try and reduce car usage, because that's the common goal. Because whether it's for health reasons or environmental reasons or just purely for congestion reasons. It's cars that's cause the problems, and if we can encourage modal shift away from the cars, then that will help the situation. Paul, you're shaking your head violently. I give you the chance to make a final response.
I often say that people blame congestion on cars. It's not the cars, it's the drivers. We need the drivers to do something different. And there's nothing wrong with the cars as long as they're full of people. No, okay. And our systems would work very, very well if all the cars and vans and so on were full of people rather than one single occupants. So I'll take the single occupant car as the target, but it's the occupant, not the car, that's the problem.
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. Whether it's passenger or freight, for that matter, if the transport is efficiently used, there's nothing wrong with it. It's inefficient use of transport that is a big problem. So, listen, our time has run out now. Thank you very much, everybody there. It's been a great session. I've found it very useful. Thank you for the four of you for all your valuable contribution.
Thank you. Enjoyed it too.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.